This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and hope for progress in the sector. With your host, Professor Judyth Sachs, former PVC Learning and Teaching at the University of Sydney, Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost at Macquarie University, and Special Advisor in Higher Education at KPMG, and now Chief Academic Officer at Studiosity. Welcome.
It gives me great pleasure to talk to Professor Alex Zelinsky, the President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Newcastle. Alex has had a varied and interesting life, but I'm going to let him talk about his life himself rather than me. But Alex, I invited you to bring an object that represents your journey as a learner and a leader, and you've got quite a story to tell.
Thank you, Judy. And what I'm going to reach for is a Boeing 787. It's a model that was given to me by Boeing in recognition of my leadership with them. But really what led to that was back in 2012. They gave me that little model plane. It was a brand new model jet that they had built, and it was very innovative at the time, as a lot of it was carbon fibre, and they used a lot of innovative technologies. But the year before, Boeing has a global set of suppliers. They're a global company and they work only with the best. And CSIRO had been a research partner of theirs for some years. And we were selected out of like 20,000 global suppliers. They have some extraordinary number of partners, and we were selected as their global supplier of the year. And I had led that engagement with Boeing for probably 5 years before, for the previous 5 years, and I really learnt a lot about delivering research with impact, or that was inspired by customer needs. So Boeing were trying to build a brand new aircraft, 787. They only sort of bring out these new class of aircraft every now and again, and it's like almost the one it was really replacing was the 747. So that was the big plane that they used for long haul, and this was the new replacement platform. So they had a lot of problems and challenges with it, various technical challenges. We didn't solve all the problems, we solved some of the problems, but we came up with a really world-class solutions for them. So, and it was really, that was a wonderful experience to get that recognition, to really know that your work is the best there is, and it's really making a difference. And I was working with a whole bunch of people in CSIRO. There's probably hundreds of people on that project over the years that we worked with them. Yeah.
So given that story, it provided you with skilled insights to not only manage complex organisations, but complex projects. How have you translated that into being a Vice-Chancellor?
Well, that's a very good question. From there, that skill set allowed me to step into the role of Chief Defence Scientist for Australia. And that was my next role. So I was a senior executive in CSIRO. Then I went on to lead DSTO, as it was known then. And again, that was a very large projects-based thing. And I was 8 years at CSIRO, then 7 years at DST. And that led me to really managing very large teams, large projects, and delivering outcomes and advice to government, which was, an example, the F-35 aircraft, which is our new fighter jet. I was right there at the beginning of the procurement of that, and to making sure it was the right plane for Australia to buy, but also to work with Australian industry to make sure that Australian industry got integrated. So a lot of it's a global platform. There's several thousand of those planes being built by many countries that are, in partnership with the US allies. And so it was a very different way of doing things. In the past, you just took a F-35, a plane, and Australia would build them locally, and you might build 50 of these things, and after that, it would be all done and dusted. But our Australian businesses are now supplying parts or components to the F-35 for the whole 2000 fleet, and as well as then supplying the spare parts for maintenance for the next 35 years. So it's a great program for Australian industry, Australian research, and a partnership. So those are the sort of efforts that made me I guess, understand the big picture, understand how government works, because I was inside government. And, and when you're a Vice-Chancellor, we are or independent organisations or standalone independent public institutions, but we do depend a lot on government, for obviously providing support for our students and research, but also the whole operating environment that we operate in is, regulated by the government. And so it's very important to be able to understand how to work back with government, and as well as also understanding how to lead large, complicated organisations, which universities are. I think it's, while I worked in CSIRO and defence, which are incredibly complex organisations, I think universities are even more complicated because of the span that we have and the complexity that we have.
So just picking up on that point, which I think is an interesting one, what have been the sort of greatest insights that you've had about universities that you didn't necessarily have before you were working in and leading one?
Yeah, I did start my career early days. I did a PhD at Wollongong University when I was a junior academic and became a professor at ANU. And then I moved into the commercial sphere and had my own startup company, which Seeing Machines, which is still around, and it's listed on the London Stock Exchange. So I certainly understood the translation of technology. I was always interested in making that impact. So certainly understand what universities are like, but I was more at the coalface. And then I moved into the commercial world and more of the world where you drive things for outcomes. So it's research with purpose, research with a delivery outcome. Sometimes less so in the discovery of science element. I did discovery science, but then I found that I was more motivated by translation and then commercialization and delivery. So in making sure that the whole thing happens. So that's been my kind of insight to happen. I guess the surprising thing that, it's not surprising, but after working elsewhere, you really sometimes forget how siloed universities can be. There's every school has got its own, mission, and then there's a college or a faculty, and then there's divisions like research divisions, education divisions, global divisions. Everyone's got their kind of own little mission, and people tend to run their own show without really realizing we're really in a kind of a matrix of sorts, where people have got a capability of people that they're trying to work towards, but you really are dependent on other people in your own organisation. The more we work together and we can find that ways of doing that productively, we can do things, achieve more. So I would say that coming into Australia, back into the Australian university system, I was still surprised how tribal it was, And, one tribe can then sometimes they fight with that, but then they unite against another bigger tribe. So it's always a contest of resources and ideas. And I think I've been spending most of my time as a leader breaking down those tribal barriers and getting everyone to say, we've got to be thinking multidisciplinary rather than single disciplines. And how can we all work together to get the best outcome?
Can we go back to your experience as an undergraduate experience? Talk to me about what it was like to be an undergraduate student at Wollongong at the time that you were a student.
So I'm a product of Wollongong, a regional area, first in family to attend university. And back, I was just coming through when universities were opened up to be free by the Whitlam government. But at the time, it still was very hard to sort of make ends meet, etc. So coming from a migrant family of modest means, but they really wanted me to study. So Wollongong back in those days was a very strong industrial town. And the University of Wollongong had a strong alignment with BHP Steel. So many people went to do apprenticeships at BHP or the local industries, and then worked in the industry, or studied at the university, generally in professions like teaching, nursing, etc., to move into the health areas. So I actually joined BHP as a cadet, and I studied and worked. But towards the end of my studies, they gave me the opportunity to study full-time for an honours degree, which was very interesting. It got me interested in research. And when the steelworks at the time in the early 80s went into a bit of a recession, you might remember the Hawke government came in. They had a national steel plan because the steel industry was uncompetitive, and they went to modernise the industries. And at that time, I took the opportunity to leave the steel industry and got interested in doing research at Wollongong, where I worked as a lecturer and did a part-time PhD in robotics.
What made you decide science was your discipline and then robotics in particular was your area of specialisation? Was that just a natural interest, or were you directed into that, or?
Well, actually, the course, I was extremely lucky when I joined BHP, and they said we're going to, and I worked in computer science and IT, and they were modernising their plans. They had started on what was called computer punch cards, and were then moving to real computers where you typed on a keyboard. But at the time, the University of Wollongong had a really outstanding professor there, a guy called Judyth Sachs, who kind of got onto the idea of operating systems and making them portable. And there's a very famous computer science operating system called Unix or Linux, and that became the system of the world. All computers basically, like what underlines the Mac user interface is Unix. So they were the first people to really start to use it and make it portable. So I was actually, while other computer science departments around the world virtually, there's only a handful in the world were sitting in front of a computer and typing programs in and not on punch cards, modern languages. And so I had a very modern curriculum. I was actually using email back in 1977.
Wow. So we could say you were an early adopter.
Because we were already, because they at that time networked the computer science departments in Australia and then connected us back to the US. And then the internet came much later, but it was called ARPANET. And so the computer science departments were where the cutting edge of IT came. So back in the 70s and 80s, the best computer science that was going on was inside universities. Now, computer science and research in the industry is done by industry, by the Googles, the Microsofts, etc. They employ the staff and the PhDs, and they're now generating breakthroughs, etc. Back then, it was done in university. So I was at the beginning of all that, and it was very inspiring. And when I worked at BHP, they were doing the first automated rolling mills. So when you make steel, you turn it into a slab, and then the slab turns into a 1.5 kilometre long coil. Mm-hmm. So it goes through this mill where the slab gets rolled down and gets longer and longer and longer. And in the end, it gets wound up. A lot of that work when they first started doing that was all done by human operators. And they were looking at screens and dials and trying to do that. That all got automated by computers, and it was done automatically. And I was part of that. And that was so exciting. And when the steelworks went into the downturn, they sort of stopped all the projects for a while they were restructuring the industry. So there was no opportunity to do that kind of work for projects. So they were going to put us on to do maintenance or kind of back office kind of work. And then the university said to me, I've realised I could go back to Wollongong Uni, which was at the cutting edge of computer science back then. And there was a professor there, Philip McKerrow and Christopher Cook, who were getting interested in robotics. This is back in the early 80s. And I was able to get involved in robotics and was able to get a grant to get one of the first sort of mobile robots that was being made in the world. And that set me off onto a career into computer vision and robotics and led me to become a professor at the ANU, and then started my own company, which became a world-leading company in its discipline area. So a lot of that, just being lucky that I was at a university that had some very talented young professors that had been hired. So that's what I've kept in mind with me. And I'm always on the look for talent, and we are seeking to appoint young people, not people right at the top of their game. They're great. They're always great. They've got resources around them. So we don't spend our time trying to pinch talent from elsewhere, but at Newcastle, we seek to attract people on the rise or people who are very passionate about emerging science areas.
So when you've just talked about your career to me, I mean, it's a remarkable career from student, early academic, establishing your own company, being successful at that, going into CSIRO as a discipline lead, going into lead defence research, and then finally coming to be a Vice-Chancellor. What do you think has been the common thread throughout that sort of leadership journey, apart from being incredibly smart?
Look, honestly, someone told me that I would be a Vice-Chancellor when I was in my 20s. I wouldn't have believed it or thought that was my destiny. I was always kind of like motivated by making a difference. And so whatever I've done, when I look back on it, it's always been 5 to 7 year commitments to something. And I just put everything into it, you know, my best efforts, and try to be the best I can be in that job for that period of time. And, you know, and I think in that time frame, you can get something done, which is lasting and has impact. So I guess the work that I'd done at BHP in my early part of my undergraduate training is one of those beautiful work integrated learning experiences. I was working and studying, so the two were reinforcing. And then I did a PhD working in a very practical area of robotics, which was the early days of robotics, and now it's becoming far more a very hot research topic. Still many research problems to be solved, but it's now got industry very much involved again. So it's replicating what happened in computer science, where all the work was done inside universities in robotics. Now robotics is moving into mature industries. So I guess that's, but along the way, I've just been focused in on what's the next job to do. So I've done the job and I look forward, what else could I do now? So after doing my startup company, I didn't really feel like I wanted to go back to the university, because I felt like I'd really learnt these skills of translation. And as it turned out, the CEO of CSIRO, Jeff Garrett, at the time, met me at a conference and saw me present something and said, we're looking for a new leader to try to drive our research into commercial outcomes and deliver outcomes that make a difference. So that's how I got into that job, and defence flowed from there. And after I'd done defence, I'd happened to be visiting University of Newcastle and gave a graduation speech a few years before. I'd been approached, and the Chancellor at the time remembered the speech that I gave about, you know, impact and translation of work and how to do that and working with industries. And they've had a sense here at Newcastle, they wanted a university that was very tightly integrated with its region. And the region had already gone through one transformation with the closure of the steelworks. But now we're moving away from fossil fuels into clean energy and renewable energy. And how could the university play a role in that translation? So that's how that opportunity came. I didn't necessarily, and I thought I could contribute to that. If I'd probably been approached or to be a Vice-Chancellor of, say, one of the G08 universities, I don't know if I would have been able to do that job, or I would have been an attractive candidate, and whether I would have been motivated to apply for the role.
So Newcastle is a thriving regional hub now in 2.5 hours north of Sydney, for people who don't know where it is. And it is transforming, and the university is actually now relocated a campus into the centre of the city. So what's the message that you're wanting to communicate about the role of University of Newcastle with the broader community of Newcastle and environments?
It's interesting. So Newcastle and the Hunter region in the Central Coast, we've got 1 million people living here, and we've only got one university, and it's a good thing, the university, but it can also be an opportunity and a challenge. And but we have got a region which is Australia's most prosperous region outside of the capital cities in Australia. So, and it's been a manufacturing heartland for Australia, as well as also being the biggest producer of energy, biggest consumer of energy, and also an innovator in the energy space. So but it has gone through transformations over the years. I mean, maybe listeners might know, in Australia's colonial past, Sydney was the first city The second city in Australia was Newcastle. The first public school in Australia was opened in Newcastle. So it's kind of got a very rich history and tapestry. So it is a region in its own right. And sometimes people start to think, well, in Australia, the only good universities we can have to be in capital cities. And I think that's a false paradigm. And if you look outside of Australia, you think of some of the great universities in the world, they're not located in capital cities. It's just Australia. So I'm trying to remind people that you just have to be in a place that has actually got some history, it's got economic backbone to it, and a willingness to go forward in an adventurous way. And I think we've got that here. And after the earthquake that hit Newcastle in the 80s, a lot of the city, some of the old buildings, which go back more than 150 years, were destroyed and had to be rebuilt or repaired. And that has actually allowed the city now to reinvent itself. And with the steelworks moving out in the 90s, it's been 25 years since the steelworks closed, the whole city has now become a very different city, very beautiful city. A lot of people used to bypass Newcastle because they thought it was just an industrial town. Well, now it's very, very cosmopolitan. The university's got a thriving campus there. Our main campus is about 9 kilometres away from the city in a suburban kind of setting. But so we've moved a lot of the disciplines like business, law, into the city, some creative industries, but the engineering aspects are based here. We've moved out a lot of our medical work into the John Hunter Hospital, and that's one of Australia's largest hospitals, acute care hospitals in Australia. So not just in the state, but in Australia. So a lot of people don't think of Newcastle as a thriving city in its own right. But when you say the city and it's the region, in a sort of broader sense, is 1 million people, well, that's a very big footprint, and we can actually do a lot. And I'm very excited to be here. So.
If we look at the broader higher education sector,
yeah,
what do you think are the 3 major challenges that are facing higher education within Australia at the moment?
Oh, look, I think it's regulation. I'm really surprised by how regulated the sector is, and I think it's important to have regulation. Wrong. But we have, in my university, we went through and did a catalogue of what legislation and regulation impacts us. It's well over 300 pieces, which is, I would say, is probably the highest in Australia, in any sector. And there's an overlap between state legislation and federal. And in recent times, the federal government has shown a propensity to regulate and legislate rather than reform or think about better ways to get efficiencies and productivity from the sector. So I think that's the regulatory challenge. The second one, I would say, that is we do have a funding problem. In Job Ready Graduates, the 2019 program that was delivered by the previous government, it had some reform elements to it, but fundamentally there's a flaw in this, 2 flaws. One is around the costing models that were used at the time. That's about the time I joined the university, and we were very concerned that the study that was done by a consultancy didn't fully capture or understand the costs associated with that. And that is actually, and then the model that then, the funding model that went there actually in some areas has led to very thin margins or negative margins. So you then have to cross-subsidise. And the cross-subsidisation, Judy, has been done through international students. That's the reality of it. To get value for students, and be able to support them, we need international students. They actually literally balance the books. So, and yet that they've also then been used particularly in capital cities, as a problem for the housing sector. It's certainly not in regional areas, but what we've got is regulation of those. I see, why are they regulating international students in regional areas? Why? There is no problem at all, 0. And yet we've got regulation unnecessary because it's a problem somewhere else in the system. And the other part of job ready graduate, which is the pricing. Very unfair in the sense that some of the arts degrees, etc., students are making a 93% contribution to the education, while other areas have less so. So if you do nursing, teaching, math degrees, so there actually there's the subsidies probably at 4 times the higher cost to arts degree student versus the other disciplines. So it's fundamentally unfair to Australian students, and it was done to sort of encourage students not to study particular disciplines and to study in other areas. And I think that's it hasn't worked. Students will want to follow their passion and what they want to do. So if they can get a place there, they'll study. But the result is then this cost of living, this HECS debts which get accumulated, etc. So that's the second sort of thing. JRG is the second challenge. And the third challenge I would put down is the social license issue and the lack of collaboration or cooperation between the government, the universities themselves, and the unions. I really was encouraged by the government and the minister when they brought out what they talked about was an accord. And if you're my age, you'll remember Bob Hawke and the Accord. The Accord was government and business and the unions sitting down and working out how they can work with each other to get a win-win situation. People gave up something to get something. What we have with our current Accord is some good recommendations there, which we would like to see implemented. But what I was expecting in the Accord was the government, the universities and the unions to work together. And we don't have that at all. In fact, the unions are spending a lot of their time attacking management and saying the problem at universities is the way they're run and governed and the governance. Look, there's some challenges, of course, in that space. No organisations are perfect, but saying that's the problem, not actually coming after and saying there's a problem with the funding. And the government itself is choosing legislation and saying, well, the universities aren't well run, so we need to bring in. One thing about legislation, I know it's free. While fixing JRG is not free, it's going to cost them money. So, quite frankly, I'm worried about this whole business. Almost, I call it the triangle of unhappiness between the government, the unions, and the universities. And really, we need to get beyond that and let's work together. And there's things that we can do. So the industrial instruments, the enterprise agreements we have are really from the last century and need reform, as well as all this over-regulation that we're getting also needs to be looked at, and then look at the funding models and then work out how many international students we need, etc. Because I know that universities, and many of them are driven and seeking to maximise that revenue to overcome the lack of funding. And the other element is, we haven't talked about much, everyone talks about the education, as I'm very worried about the research agenda. There's the SIRD, the Strategic Evaluation of Research and Development, is underway, and it'll probably hit the government soon. But I want to make sure, I'd like to see the Accord with its reforms and the SIRD are not like two ships in the night that pass. Mm-hmm. The Minister for Education, Jason Clare, is doing a fantastic job around education. You can see he's very passionate around that, from school education, early childhood, all the way through, and including TAFE. But he's also got research in his portfolio, and we don't hear him talk about that enough.
So you talked about students earlier. If there was one thing that you could do as Vice-Chancellor to sort of support your students to be successful, what would that be?
Oh, look, if I had an idea, and after I've been here 7 years, we're implementing them. So one of the big ideas that we had, which goes back to my whole mantra of being connected, we've brought in career-ready placements, or you might use it, work-integrated learning, which is compulsory for every single undergraduate student, irrespective of discipline, to have a minimum of 140 hours with an employer in industry. So it could be government, it could be not-for-profit, it could be an industry. So so we always had that, obviously, for engineering, nursing, teaching, but we never had it for business. You know, the science graduates, the arts graduates, etc. So now we've implemented across the whole university. So you cannot graduate without a career-ready placement. We're the first university in Australia to do that. And the feedback we're getting from students and employers is fantastic. So the employers are, saying once they finish their career-ready placement, we offer quite a few of them part-time work while they can finish off the degree. And from that part-time work, we're also now moving into graduate employment. So it's working. So that's the one thing I tried to implement in my time here, and we've now implemented it, and it's very successful. So if I stay longer, what's the next big thing? We can talk about that. So.
Okay, what is the next big thing?
Well, look, I actually think the next thing really is to make sure that we get student success. And university, when you look at the raw data, so 1 in 3 students finishes the degree that they started in. So 2 in 3 finish something, and they might start in one area and finish in another. It's not a bad thing. So but there's another third that don't complete, and that's not good enough for Australia. I think we're above that, but I would like to see that every student that comes here can finish university with a degree or maybe a diploma or a certificate, something to show for their efforts other than a HECS debt, because if you don't complete a qualification, you walk away with the debt and not the qualification. So I want to make sure that our students, we get that success and completion rate right up.
So you've been to many graduations in your time as Vice-Chancellor. And I do know that you're known for walking around the campus and being visible at talking to people and talking to students. So what advice do you give to students about preparing for a challenging and ambiguous future?
Yes, that's an interesting question, Judy. I always say, first of all, follow your dreams. Always have big dreams. You've got to dream big. And when I was a student, my parents were just very keen on me just to get a job. And unemployment was pretty high back in the 70s and 80s, around 10, 11% at times. And so there was a sense of just getting a job and getting on to a professional career would be enough. But they didn't say to me, you could go on and do bigger things or greater things. That was not in their kind of thinking. They were just thinking they were grateful and that they could get me to uni, and that when I got a job and I was happily married, etc. So that was there. And I suppose that when I talk to my kids now, I'd say, look, dream big. You shoot for the stars, you might hit the moon. And the other bit of thing, if anyone says things, ask me what's a bit of practical advice or something, I say, try to say yes more often to opportunity. So someone can come and offer you something and you think, oh, should I do that? Doesn't feel comfortable. It's not in my exactly what I wanted to do. But sometimes you should say yes and then go and explore that, particularly when you're young and in training opportunities to do a variety of jobs. And particularly sometimes bigger organisations move you around. They say, look, when I worked for BHP, they'd say, look, are you available to go up to Newcastle, for example? I came up here a couple of times as a young person to do some short work for a few months. And I would always just say yes, rather than, well, it's a bit inconvenient. I've got some things, I've got work-life balance, and you could think of why you wouldn't do that. And the job didn't sound that interesting, or it could have been, it looked like it was a 50-50, So people, I think, sometimes picky and choosy, and I just say yes more often, and you just don't know where it leads to.
And Alex, I've got one last sort of more whimsical question to ask you. What are you reading at the moment?
There was one I just picked up. I just two books. Abundance. That was I heard some people read. It's a very interesting book. And the other one I kind of read multiple books at once. I like also biographies of people and lives. So I did read one recently about Elon Musk. I've always been fascinated about him. So he's kind of gone from tech pioneer to a political figure who's now a media kind of mogul in a sense. And, it's not a very good story there exactly, I think. But I was very interested and I read that one. But just trying to understand what's been happening, and also an insight into what was happening at Tesla, because it's got this self-driving cars. And that's where my company, Seeing Machines, was into self-driving cars. And we came to the conclusion that you couldn't really rely on a car driving totally on its own and no driver input. It's a bit like getting into a plane and they said you've got an autopilot, so we don't need pilots at all. So the pilots are there to take over when the autopilot can't work, and that's what, and Tesla was kind of pitching something else. And I think they've really been irresponsible. So, but I think that was the story. That's what motivated me to find out what was going on. That's why I read that one. But I've been very interested in this abundance one, which is a bit different economic theories and where we're going. So I always read, and now we're getting close to the end of the year. I usually get a pile of books to read over the summer when I take a few weeks off.
Alex, thank you for giving me 40 minutes of your time. I've really enjoyed it, and I've known of you from afar, and I've respected University of Newcastle for a long time. So I wish you and your colleagues a safe and happy holiday season. And I hope that 2026 is one of abundance where everybody can thrive and students can be successful.
Thank you so much, Judy. It was a real pleasure talking to you. And thank you for taking this sort of sector leadership role in trying to talk to leaders to get conversations going, because I think we need to have more conversations about the sector. I think at the moment we're in a bit of a funk, and everybody's in a downward kind of discussion. I think there's so much potential, and higher education is the future for Australia, and we've got to remember that.
You have been listening to Studiosity's podcast, Reimagining Higher Education, candid conversations within higher education, sharing stories of leadership, change, and best practice in teaching and learning. Visit studiosity.com.